Redditors who clean up crime scenes. What's the most bizarre thing you've witnessed? Crime scene cleaner here. My first suicide cleanup was quite an experience. Man shot himself in the head in his garage. I'll never forget needing to use pliers to pull teeth and skull fragments out of the drywall behind where he sat. All that blood and brain managed to make its way more than 50 feet across the garage. Most disturbing though was his pickup. We chose to take it to our company wash bay to pressure wash it and make sure it was as clean as possible. I cleaned it myself and was satisfied that I had done well. Inspected for blood and couldn't find anything. So I began driving it back to the owner's garage. On the way back a slight drizzle began and switched on the wiper blades. Imagine my horror as a chunk of brain streaks across my newly cleaned windshield. I pulled over quickly and cleaned it up. But it still makes me sick to think what would have happened if it didn't rain that day. This man's poor wife or daughter would have been met with that sight and been crushed again by the impact of suicide. That 10 years ago and I'll never forget it. Now I triple or quadruple check every job. I don't clean up crime scenes, but I do remove the deceased. I can get into more accurate D. My job is to clear landmines. I clean war crimes. You can say, yay. Bit of a stretch. I know. And X200B. Recently a cow had walked into a minefield in our area of operations and stepped on a small anti-personnel mine. However, this mine was boosted by having been buried on top of a directional fragmentation mine. Gamers and soldiers. Think Claymore. But bigger. The cow had literally been split in half, with cow intestines spread all over the area and hanging from trees like Hannibal's Christmas ornaments. Family member did heavy duty cleaning including crime scenes. A guy shot his head off with a shotgun. EMTs were supposed to pick him up, literally, but missed a large chunk of brain behind a couch. That was when said family member decided to find other engagement. I can relate to this. FFEMT. Respond to suicide with a rifle. He dead. Nothing for us to do but pronounce. Cops cover the body. Then want to escort the family out of the death scene because everyone is processed like a crime scene regardless and it is the only way in or out of the property. Before they did so, though, my partner had to point out the guy's remarkably intact brain just sitting in the tree over his body. I occasionally work on the weekends for a funeral home. It's decent money for what is essentially 2 hours of call out work when their normal staff is off. Last year I was called in at around 5 in the morning. A 30-something-year-old guy had killed himself, shot himself, in a pretty small 2-bedroom apartment. That wasn't the bizarre part at all since I've seen it before on call outs. What was bizarre was what was in the apartment. Literally thousands of documents. Piled on the floor. On a desk. On shelves. Of people's financial information. CR. My best friend used to have this job. Most of the bizarre stuff was cleaning up suicides. Found a guy's full intact mustache across the room when he blew his head off with a shotgun. One guy tried to kill himself by shooting his stomach with a small caliber pistol. He didn't die immediately so he wrote tons of whacked out stuff on the walls with his blood. Then finished the job. Was dispatched to a vehicle versus pedestrian call a couple months ago. And when we arrived on scene it was like something out of a movie. Dude was running across a fairly busy 4-lane road and was hit by a car traveling about 55 miles per hour. After his head went through the windshield of the first vehicle he then proceeded to be thrown into the opposite lane and was ran over and dragged about 20 yards by another vehicle. Once the coroner was on scene with traffic investigations we proceeded to pick up his organs bit by bit. It was a fantastic anatomy lesson. I used to work in forensics picking up decedents as well as assisting the medical examiner in conduction of the autopsy. Not necessarily cleaning up the scene but I've seen a guy who, during some kind of psychotic break, completely castrated his entire package. He then proceeded to stuff the entire package into his mouth and down his throat. He then slit his own throat. Did all of this with a cheap kitchen knife in his shower. Cause: exsanguination complicating transverse carotid and jugular severance. Manner: Suicide. User team-op. Propane nat gas explosion. Guy's arm was holding onto a ladder going up a holding tank. No body. No anything. Just an arm. Preemptive. I don't clean them for a living but had to clean a few apartments when my uncle managed an apartment complex. We had one tenant OD on heroin. He sat there for roughly 3 weeks before anyone noticed the smell. They took his body and left it to us to clean up. The dude vomited on the ceiling. There were little dry droplets of vomit all over the ceiling right above where he died, and to top it off he basically liquefied and left a puddle of gut juices on the concrete foundation underneath the carpet. I thought that tea was left to a professional team. But I guess it's optional, and if you don't want to pay for it, you can scoop the brains and blood up yourself. Okay. Not a crime scene cleaner but I'm a medic. Have a few bizarre ones. Came into a home to find a man who had attempted to commit suicide by putting a pistol under his jaw but failed, had a second thought. He ended up having to crawl 5 feet away to where he had thrown the pistol after only blowing the left side of his face off to finish the job. The second one did the trick. Just about every surface in his living room had some remnant of the poor guy. He left behind 2 kids. Another time we had a husband who had caught his wife cheating and had turned on the garbage disposal and forced her arm down it. Massive hemorrhaging. But unfortunately she was D.O.A. Husband ended up with a self-inflicted shotgun wound. Sir. People really don't understand just how messy a shotgun can make things. Think the Hulk smashing a blood and brain-filled Pinata. And this one was more weird than anything, but here goes. Older gentleman we were called to after police performed a wellness check, late 70s. Nice house. Nice foreign car in the driveway. Pictures of prayers and crosses all over the house. We head into the bedroom and there he is, naked except for what I assume was one of those S9 Halloween costumes. Honestly I don't know, but he ended up having a heart attack mid-pleasure time while choking himself with a rosary. Definitely one of the weirdest things I ever saw during my time working the box. So, I work in healthcare. Crazy stuff comes in all the time. One time a woman came in who was shot in the vagina. She was dirty. In only a bra. I thought she was a prostitute tossed from a car. Turns out she was drinking with her BF and another guy. She and the BF got into a fight. Like, serious fight. The BF starts choking her out. So the friend runs upstairs. Grabs a gun. And tries to shoot out the legs of the BF. Well, he missed and shot her instead. Took a bit of explaining to clear that up. A friend of mine is a firefighter and he told me about a scene of a wreck he showed up to. When he arrived there was a Corvette smashed under a trailer of an 18-wheeler. When they finally pulled the two apart, the driver of the Corvette's body was intact in the front seat with cell phone in hand. Meanwhile his head was in the back seat. Turns out he had been going at least 70 miles per hour while texting and didn't realize there was a red light and rammed into the back of an 18-wheeler. Just trying to do my part to get actual crime cleaners here, but I'm a medic, so similar I guess. One time we found this guy dead in his home in the corner of the living room, tucked around the couch. Ass up, no cloths on. Literal coffee ground looking tea spread everywhere across the house. On the floors. Furniture. Walls. Everywhere. Along with mass amounts of liquor bottles and glass everywhere. He had massive GI issues along with drinking himself to death. Don't know what was worse. The smell or the scene. I was at this house cleaning up a suicide. It was a beautiful young woman in her 20s who had killed herself with her prescribed antidepressant. The investigators had left, so it was just me and my partner there. We just had to put her in a body bag and take her to the morgue. I went out to the ambulance to get the body bag stretcher. Walk back in the house to see my partner raping the girl's corpse. The strangest part is that he seemed like a totally normal dude. I would have even said we were friends. He's in prison now. Don't know if this counts as a crime scene. But at my work we had to pick teeth out of a rock garden after a guy blew his head off with a shotgun. I think if people understood just how much of a mess a shotgun to the head makes, then a lot of some suicides would have other methods. craziest shit I ever hear as an EMT in training was a cops and EMTs responding to a GSW gunshot wound. Cops where I live have to clear the scene first before medical personnel can go in. They find the guy. Head completely missing from the lower mandible upward. 2 boys scared shitless hiding under their beds after witnessing him blow his head off with a 12 gauge. Medics where I live are legally required to check for a pulse. As one does and the other, they are tandem, calls it in. Said dead body stands up and sits back down. Then does it 2 more times. The last one puts its hands out like Frankenstein. Keep in mind there is nothing from the jawline up. The second officer said if he does it 1 more time he is shooting him. As morbid as it is. I laughed at that part. Oh, I have a story about someone who launched their entrails over a bathroom that's probably 81 square feet. I clean up biohazard material, dead bodies, for my company on occasion because I'm one of the only 2 that's certified. My co-worker went into a house to clean a body but the boss failed to mention they had been dead for 2 weeks. Okay. Whatever, I can deal with that. We walked to the house and not only could you smell it from the start of the driveway, but all the windows were black. Okay. This dude had blackout curtains, I understand that. We suited up and went into the house, which was relatively clean given the circumstances. We knew he died in the bathroom so we made our way upstairs and followed the flies. So, you know how flies swarm decaying things? Yeah, it wasn't blackout curtains in the bathroom. The windows were caked in so many flies that sunlight couldn't come in. My boss also failed to mention he died in the bathtub. You hear about bloating and blah blah blah, but do you know what happens when a body sits in a bathtub for 2 weeks and soaks up all that water? It explodes. The entrails and remains of this soup was all over the taking. The walls. The door. It was everywhere. There was no water in the bathtub, just this sickly pink colored stew. That was the most disgusting cleanup I've done by far. I can't even imagine what it sounded like when that happened. I do clean up crime scenes, but the best job I've done wasn't a crime scene. An older gentleman ordered a lady of the night for a good time back at his hotel. Popped some Viagra and while they were doing the deed something in his penis ruptured or tore and blood just started spraying literally everywhere. Blood on the bed, floor, almost every wall, little on the ceiling and a ton on the bathroom mirror. It looked like Dexter's playground. The guy survived. I guess the injury wasn't as bad as the scene would suggest, but holy hell was that an intense job. My dad spent just shy of 40 years as a police officer in the suburbs of a decently sized city. We were hardly ever in the news. We didn't have a lot of crime or violence, but every so often something really fked up would come up. His 2 examples that if brought up still make him shiver are walking into an apartment on Valentine's Day where a guy had lopped the head off of his wife. The head was just sitting there on the floor. The other was someone had dismembered the victim in an effort to hide the body and presumably dropped it off at the local dump. This led to him and others having to walk the dump to look for body parts. In the end they found a pair of legs, but it was all that could be recovered. My dad used to clean up crime and trauma scenes about 10 years ago and said he had to clean up a suicide one time where he found bits of brain on top of a ceiling fan. He thought that was the worst of it until they moved a TV stand and found a nose behind it. Obligatory not a crime scene cleaner, but my dad was a fireman and had some stories similar to ones in this thread, so thought I'd share. One of the worst he ever told me was when working at the Black Saturday bushfires here in Australia. He was doing some checks in houses they had the fire controlled in. They went in 4-5 houses and found no one. Then they went into the last house. It was my dad and 2 other guys searching. My dad opens the bathroom door to see a lady holding on to 3 very young, between 1 and 5 years old, kids who had all been burned to death. The lady was still alive but very badly burnt and was just sitting there on the floor holding her dead kids in complete shock. Apparently she didn't even react to my dad opening the door. There was also another one where he showed up to a car crash and the driver was missing his head, but with no way out of the car they just assumed it would be in the car somewhere. So they eventually get the car open, doors were stuck closed, but can't find this guy's head. Turns out it had made it about 20 meters away from the car. My dad said he never figured out how the guy's head was so cleanly cut off or how in the hell it ended so far away from the car. His only theory was the door opened before the crash. The guy slipped and started falling out of the car when he slammed into whatever he hit and the door slammed shut and cut his head off. But he also said that theory doesn't make much sense because the guy was sitting up in the seat when he was found. I don't do any sort of thing. But if anyone is interested in hearing some in-depth stories from someone who does, there is a podcast called The Cleaning of John Doe. It goes pretty in-depth and it's very informative. But definitely not for the faint of heart. I went on a few ride-alongs with the county coroner. Worst was a woman that slit her wrists and maybe panicked because blood was on every inch of the bathroom. She fell into the tub where she died. But she left bizarre notes everywhere, leaving things to people. Like her used hairspray to an individual and why. Just lots of post-it notes for her garbage she left to people. A while back, 1999 I think, I was working in a small town as an EMT. We got a call about someone being injured in a house. Some kind of gas leak explosion. We get there and this guy is a bloody mess in the middle of the street. One of our responders goes to get him. And he starts licking her hands and coming onto her. Telling her about all the women he has killed. Naturally she freaked out and backed off. Just in time for him to lay his head down. And promptly get run over by the back wheel of one of the ambulances. Turns out the guy was a serial killer in that town for like 20 years. And he just happened to get involved in a random accident that revealed him. 1999 was a bizarre summer. A family friend removes the deceased from their homes. etc. since they own their own funeral home. They said that the weirdest thing they saw was a woman lying face up in a tub and a man laying on top of her. When she took them apart, she knew why they were like that. Guy had domestic abuse problems and they were going through a separation. Kids in the other room. Mum in the bathroom doing her hair. The guy comes in and just stabs her several times. Puts her in the tub and places the knife in her hands while he jumps on top of her and stabs himself either in the chest or abdomen and bleeds out. She said she'll never forget how sad and unusual it was. Especially for those kids who thankfully were asleep. I think her mom found them. I hate thinking about it and I hope that family can heal. Open bracket. Mexican guy here. I work in the public ministry. Can't recall the English words for Ministerio Público. I had to see the chaos that arose circa 2012 with organized crime. Pits full of body parts, like. Really fully. Tons. So many never get identified. Beheaded men hanging from bridges. Many works partners that simply disappeared to never be seen again. Back in the day. Did kinda this work. Cleaned up a homicide where guy goes back to woman's apartment. Start fooling around. Finds out woman is actually a crossdresser, so kills the person, then tries to burn down the apartment to cover up the murder. Many different types of dildos throughout the apartment and huge amount of wigs burnt into the carpet to the point it was so heavy. We had to cut the carpet in small pieces due to the weight. Not even close to crime scene cleanup. Unless you consider the poor f***ing tow driver that has to tow suicide and homicide cars trucks. Had a pickup with one rider from police impound. I get there and a wicked paint job on this car. Weird patterns over white paint. Interior was a purplish color. Not putting 2+2 I got in. Notice the glove box open with a handprint on it. 3 seconds later it hit me. All this shit is blood. The flecks were what was left of his brain. The cool paint job was powder for prints. Needless to say, cussed out my boss to the I should have been fired area. Burned my clothes and showered for hours. Mind you, this was put through an auto club. Some arsehole out here took that call and didn't even add hazmat label to it. FCKUW. There you are. Not me. But a friend of mine interned at the local ME office. One day shared with me that they were called on scene to collect a body. Guy died of a heart attack completely naked on the couch surrounded by PRN movies. Last thing he yelled at his wife was, "Just leave me the FCK alone," before shutting himself in his den. The weird thing was his wife hadn't checked on him for a couple of days and just left him there before finding him and calling the police. Oh. And there was a cat box in the corner of the room with crap in it. The wife reported that they have no cats. I had a resident in the apartment building I managed pass away. He drank himself to death in his tiny 300 square FT studio. There wasn't a place on the floor where the beer cans didn't cover 2-3 deep. At 10 cents each in Oregon for recycling. I made $75. Not my story. Essentially a friend of a friend's. Someone called 911. Reporting a stench in a flat below them. EMTs and the like show up. Find a guy who had been left in the apartment for a couple weeks. The guy had drank and Drano. The drain unclogged stuff. There was a trail of blood leading across the bedroom. And his body was crouched in a corner. Both his hands were at his side. But it looked like he had a hand coming out of his throat. It was his digestive organs which had essentially exploded out of his mouth when it came into contact with the Drano. I don't clean up crime scenes. But my parents did when I was a kid. There was a gun-inflicted suicide and they got called in. So they went to clean and whatever. They got home late that night and brought a shop vac in and told me not to touch it. I asked them why and they informed me that it contained some brain matter from cleaning earlier. This isn't exactly what was asked, but it's something I won't forget. We had some poor guy's brain pieces in our industrial vacuum, sitting in our den.